You would not believe what they found in Dan Blocker's will, not because it revealed a shocking fortune or a hidden secret, but because of what it stirred inside the people who loved him most. Dan Blocker, the gentle giant who played Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza, was more than a co-star to the cast. He was their anchor, their constant, and their friend. When he died suddenly in May of 1972, the loss stunned Hollywood and devastated the set. Viewers saw the grief reflected on screen. Yet the hardest moments came later, away from cameras and scripts, when his personal affairs were quietly settled. The will itself was never made public in detail, but its existence marked a turning point. For the cast, it became a reminder of promises made, years shared, and a presence that was suddenly gone. What they faced in that moment was not about inheritance but about finality, and that truth left them in tears. Long before Dan Blocker ever stepped onto a television set, his life followed a path that could not have been further removed from Hollywood ambition. He was born on December 10, 1928, in the small town of DeKalb, Texas, a place where fame was not a goal and attention was not a currency. The values that shaped him there emphasized responsibility, steadiness, and showing up when you were needed, traits that would later define his presence in ways no script ever could. Blocker grew up in Texas and Oklahoma, moving as many families did in search of stability rather than opportunity. Education mattered in his household, not as a stepping stone to celebrity, but as a foundation for independence. He attended college, served in the United States Army during the Korean War era, and later earned advanced degrees, including a master's degree in dramatic arts. Even then, acting was not framed as a dream waiting to be fulfilled. It was a skill, one of many, that he approached with discipline rather than expectation. Before television found him, Dan Blocker worked as a teacher. He stood in classrooms, not sound stages, responsible for guiding students rather than entertaining audiences. That experience left a mark. Teaching requires patience, consistency, and the ability to read people quietly, and those qualities became part of who Blocker was long before cameras rolled. When he eventually moved toward acting, it was not a dramatic leap, but a careful transition made with practicality in mind. Hollywood in the 1950s was filled with men chasing stardom. Dan Blocker was not one of them. His physical presence made him stand out, yet his temperament kept him grounded. Early roles came and went, modest appearances that paid bills but did not promise permanence. Fame did not arrive with fanfare, and Blocker did not behave as though it was owed to him. He worked, learned, and went home. His personal life reflected that same steadiness. In August of 1952, he married Dolphia Lee Parker, a partnership that would last the rest of his life. Together they raised 4 children, building a family life that remained largely private even as his career began to grow. Unlike many actors whose personal lives unraveled under attention, Blocker's remained rooted, protected by the same values he carried from his upbringing. This grounding mattered, because it shaped how he entered the role that would define him. When Dan Blocker was cast in Bonanza in 1959, he did not arrive believing the show would become a cultural landmark, or that his character would be remembered decades later. On paper, Hoss Cartwright was not positioned as the star. He was part of an ensemble, one piece of a larger story. Blocker treated it that way, as a job to be done well, not a pedestal to climb. That mindset made all the difference. Audiences responded to Hoss, not because he dominated scenes, but because he felt real. The warmth, restraint, and quiet strength Blocker brought to the role did not come from acting tricks. They came from a life lived outside the spotlight, shaped by responsibility rather than ambition. What no one could have predicted at the time was how deeply that grounded presence would embed itself into the heart of the show. Dan Blocker did not set out to become essential. He became essential by being himself, consistently and without pretense. And that reality sets the stage for everything that followed. Because when someone like that disappears, the absence cuts far deeper than anyone expects. When Dan Blocker arrived on the set of Bonanza in 1959, nothing about the moment suggested history was being made. The series itself was an experiment, one of the first hour-long westerns filmed in color, and its future was uncertain. For Blocker, the role of Hoss Cartwright was another steady job, one that promised work, structure, and a chance to apply his training without demanding more than he was willing to give. Hoss was not designed to carry the series. The early focus rested on Ben Cartwright's authority, Adam's intellect, and Little Joe's charm. Hoss existed as balance, the physical presence who softened conflict and grounded the family. Blocker leaned into that purpose without trying to expand it. He did not reshape the role to chase attention. Instead, he let the character breathe, trusting that authenticity would be enough. Audiences responded almost immediately. Viewers saw something familiar in Hoss, a kindness that did not require explanation. Letters arrived praising the character's decency, and ratings reflected that connection. Over time, Hoss became the emotional center of the Cartwright family, not because the scripts demanded it, but because the audience felt it. What began as a supporting role quietly grew into something irreplaceable. Behind the scenes, the same shift took place. Bonanza was demanding, with long shooting days and the pressure of remaining one of television's most watched programs. Tensions were inevitable. Personalities clashed, creative differences surfaced, and expectations grew heavier with each successful season. In that environment, Dan Blocker became a stabilizing force without ever being appointed one. Crew members respected him for his consistency. Co-stars trusted him because he did not posture or compete. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried weight because they were rare. That calm presence became a kind of anchor, holding the rhythm of the set together when stress threatened to pull it apart. The contrast became clearer when change arrived. Pernell Roberts left the series, dissatisfied with his character's direction, and the show adjusted. It survived because the emotional balance remained intact. Blocker's presence helped absorb that shift. The routine continued. The family dynamic on screen still felt whole. As the years passed, Bonanza grew into an institution. Seasons blended together, and the cast aged alongside their audience. What once felt temporary began to feel permanent. For those working on the show, that sense of continuity mattered. Dan Blocker embodied it. He showed up year after year, grounded by a private life that remained stable and separate from his fame. He did not treat success as something fragile or fleeting. He treated it as work to be respected. That attitude shaped how others around him approached the long grind of television production. When frustration surfaced, Blocker's steadiness often diffused it before it escalated. He was not the loudest voice in the room, but he was the one people noticed when he wasn't there. By the early 1970s, it was difficult to imagine Bonanza without him. Hoss Cartwright had become synonymous with warmth, loyalty, and moral clarity, and Dan Blocker's own personality reinforced that image rather than contradicting it. The line between character and man blurred in a way that felt reassuring, not artificial. That sense of permanence would soon be shattered. Without warning, the routine that had held for more than a decade would break. And when it did, everyone involved would realize just how much of the show's heart had rested quietly in Dan Blocker's hands. By the spring of 1972, Bonanza felt settled into its own history. The routines were familiar, the relationships well-worn, and the sense of continuity gave everyone involved the quiet confidence that tomorrow would look much like yesterday. That illusion ended on May 13, 1972, when Dan Blocker died suddenly at the age of 43 from a pulmonary embolism following gallbladder surgery. The shock did not register all at once. News traveled quickly, yet disbelief lingered. A routine procedure was not supposed to end a life. Blocker had not been ill in a way that suggested danger, and no one around him had been preparing for goodbye. That lack of warning deepened the impact. There was no emotional runway, no gradual acceptance. only an abrupt absence where certainty had lived. Production on Bonanza paused, but grief did not follow a schedule. The cast and crew were left with an impossible task, continuing a show built on family after losing one of its emotional pillars. Unlike earlier changes, this was not a professional departure or a creative disagreement. It was final, unalterable, and deeply personal. NBC and the show's producers faced immediate decisions. Recasting Hoss Cartwright was dismissed early, not as a business calculation, but as an acknowledgement that Dan Blocker's presence could not be replicated. The character had grown beyond the page, shaped by Blocker's temperament as much as by the scripts themselves. To replace him would have felt hollow. Instead, the loss was folded into the narrative. The season 14 opener, titled Forever, aired on September 12, 1972. The episode bore the weight of real mourning. Its tone was heavier, its pacing slower, and its absence unmistakable. Viewers sensed the difference even if they did not know every detail. The grief on screen reflected something genuine, something unresolved. Michael Landon, who had worked closely with Blocker for more than a decade, helped reshape the episode after his death. Years later, Landon admitted that when he needed to cry for a scene, he would think of losing Dan Blocker. That statement was not offered as nostalgia. It was a window into how deeply the loss had embedded itself. The grief had not passed. It had been absorbed. As the season continued, the show struggled to regain its footing. Ratings declined, and the energy that once drove the series felt diminished. Official explanations would later point to shifting television trends and changing audience tastes, but within the cast, the truth felt simpler. The heart of the show had been damaged. By January of 1973, Bonanza reached the end of its long run. The cancellation marked the close of an era, but it also marked the point where the cast could no longer rely on routine to soften the loss. Filming ended. Schedules cleared. The shared work that had once provided distraction was gone. Only then did the grief fully settle in. Without scripts to memorize or scenes to rehearse, the permanence of Dan Blocker's absence became unavoidable. His death was no longer something to work around. It was something to live with. This transition from shock to acceptance did not happen publicly. There were no dramatic interviews or grand statements. Instead, the reckoning unfolded quietly, as personal affairs were addressed, and life continued without him. That moment, away from cameras and applause, carried a different weight. It forced everyone who had depended on Dan Blocker's steadiness to confront a truth they had delayed. The loss was no longer theoretical, it was final. And that realization would lead directly into the moment that followed, when legal closure made emotional closure impossible to avoid. When the noise finally faded, and the routines that had once filled every day were gone, reality arrived in a quieter form. This was the stage of loss that no one prepares for, the administrative aftermath that follows grief whether anyone feels ready or not. For Dan Blocker's family, that meant settling his estate. For those who had worked beside him for more than a decade, it marked a different kind of ending. There was a will. Dan Blocker had been married since August of 1952 and left behind his wife Dolphia Lee Parker and their 4 children. That alone shaped the process. His responsibilities were clear, and his priorities had always pointed inward toward family rather than outward toward public display. What stood out was not what the will revealed, but what it did not. No detailed contents were released publicly. No statements were issued listing bequests or final messages. There were no reported surprises. No symbolic gestures made for headlines. The legal process moved forward quietly, as most do, and the details remained private. In an industry accustomed to spectacle, that restraint carried unexpected emotional weight. For the cast of Bonanza, this was the moment when finality became impossible to ignore. Death had already taken Dan Blocker, but the structure of work had softened the blow. Scripts had been rewritten, scenes adjusted, and schedules maintained. The will closed a different door, It confirmed that the man they had relied on was not coming back in any form, not even through unfinished business. This realization did not come with drama. It arrived with paperwork, signatures, and silence. The absence of public detail forced those closest to Blocker to confront the loss without distraction. There was nothing to analyze, nothing to debate, nothing to reinterpret. The life they had shared with him had ended cleanly and completely. The emotional response that followed was not about exclusion or entitlement. There is no evidence that cast members expected to be included in his will, nor is there any record suggesting they were. What struck them was the boundary the document represented. For years they had functioned like a family, bound by routine, trust, and shared history. The will reminded them that this bond, however deep, belonged to a different category than blood. That realization hurt more than any dramatic revelation could have. It clarified what grief often obscures. Some relationships feel permanent because they are lived daily, yet they end without ceremony. The cast did not mourn what they did not receive. They mourned the loss of a role in his life that had once felt enduring. Michael Landon's later reflections help explain this shift. His acknowledgement that Blocker's death stayed with him long after filming ended suggests that the emotional reckoning took time. Grief unfolded in layers, first as shock, then as adaptation, and finally as acceptance when the last ties were formally closed. For Dan Blocker's family, the will represented responsibility fulfilled. He had lived as he had worked, steady, private, and focused on those closest to him. That consistency became part of his legacy. For his colleagues, it reinforced something they had not wanted to face. Their connection to him, though genuine and meaningful, now existed only in memory. This moment did not generate headlines. Yet it became one of the most emotionally difficult chapters of the story. It stripped away illusion and left only truth. Dan Blocker's life had been completed, and nothing remained unresolved. In that clarity, grief found its final shape, not loud or dramatic, but deep and enduring. And once that truth settled in, the cast of Bonanza understood that what Dan Blocker left behind could not be measured in documents. It lived instead in the space he once filled, now permanently empty. What remained after the paperwork was finished, and the final season faded into television history, was not something that could be summarized or explained. Dan Blocker's legacy did not announce itself loudly, and it did not arrive with a clear ending. It lingered in quieter places, in memory, in influence, and in the way people spoke his name years later. For his family, life continued away from public view. Dan Blocker had always guarded that separation. His wife Dolphia Lee Parker and their 4 children had lived alongside his success without being consumed by it. That boundary remained intact after his death. He had provided for them, closed his affairs, and left them the privacy he valued while he was alive. In that sense, his final act mirrored the life he had lived, deliberate, steady, and focused on those closest to him. Within the world of Bonanza, the absence never fully faded. The series ended in January of 1973, not long after Blocker's death. And while many factors contributed to that decision, the timing carried symbolic weight. The show that had once felt unshakable concluded soon after losing the man who quietly held its emotional center. For those who had been part of it, the ending felt less like cancellation and more like closure. Michael Landon's later reflections offer insight into how deeply Blocker's influence endured. Landon did not speak of him as a colleague who had moved on, but as a presence that stayed with him. The fact that he drew on that loss to access emotion long after filming ended speaks to how profoundly the absence reshaped him. Grief became part of his emotional vocabulary, not something left behind with the show. Fans, too, carried Dan Blocker forward. Hoss Cartwright remained a symbol of decency, kindness, and moral clarity, qualities that audiences continued to associate with Blocker himself. For many viewers, Hoss was comfort. He represented fairness without arrogance and strength without cruelty. Those qualities did not fade with reruns or changing television trends. They endured because they felt honest. The restaurant brand associated with his name, Ponderosa and Bonanza Steakhouse, continued long after his passing. While the business evolved under new ownership, the connection remained part of his public legacy, a reminder that his influence extended beyond acting. Even there, his presence was understated, more association than spotlight. What stands out most, looking back, is how little Dan Blocker needed to explain himself. He did not craft a public persona separate from his private values. He did not chase recognition beyond the work he was given. When he died, there were no unanswered questions about who he was or what mattered to him. That clarity became its own kind of comfort. The cast of Bonanza did not measure his impact by awards or earnings. They measured it by the space he left behind. The will closed the legal chapter of his life, but it did not close the emotional one. That chapter remained open in shared stories, unspoken understanding, and the recognition that some people shape a place simply by being there. Dan Blocker's greatest legacy was not written down. It lived in steadiness, in reliability, and in the way he made others feel supported without ever asking for credit. When he was gone, the loss revealed itself fully, not through documents or declarations, but through silence. And in that silence, the truth became clear. Dan Blocker had left behind something far more enduring than anything a will could describe. In the end, what they found in Dan Blocker's will was not something that could be listed or explained. It marked a final boundary, a quiet confirmation that his life had reached its close and that the man who had anchored so many others was now part of memory. The emotion it stirred came from recognition, not revelation. Dan Blocker lived without spectacle and left the same way. He built a life grounded in family, consistency, and quiet strength. And when it ended, there were no loose threads left behind. For the cast of Bonanza, that clarity carried its own weight. It forced them to accept that some bonds, no matter how deep, end without ceremony. What remained was legacy. Hoss Cartwright still stands as a symbol of decency and warmth, and Dan Blocker's presence still lingers in the way his colleagues and fans remember him. His impact was never written down, yet it endures. For more emotional stories, check out this video.